Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming back to this second session for Introduction to PowerMill Automation. So I know it says part 1 on the screen, but this is the second part of 2 in the series. So let me just kind of continue on from where I left off on Monday. Well, I hope in between that time, between Monday and now, that you're able to kind of play around with some of the stuff that we showed you on templates, recording some macros. Hopefully you guys were successful on that. I don't know if I mentioned it on Monday or not, but a really good place to go for any type of support on this is always the PowerMill forum. So if you haven't been there, I suggest to go there to start if you have any questions that generate. There's a lot of people, including myself, that jump on there and we help out whenever we can. So let me just kind of advance to where we left off on Monday. I'm just going to fast forward here. So just a recap of why we automate. Templates, we discussed what templates are, and I believe we kind of left off around here what a macro is. So we're definitely going to dive back into the macros. We'll start maybe modifying a little bit more. We're going to go ahead and create a new one. But just advancing the slide here real quick, I just want to kind of explain the difference between what a macro is and what an API is. So there's 2 different methods on how you can kind of capture the developmental code and use it to your advantage. One is a macro, which we looked at on Monday, and the other is an API. So an API stands for Application Programming Interface. The main difference between an API and a macro is exactly that. You can basically create your own interface. So this is where you can kind of really take control of the software and you can customize or tailor it to maybe what you need it for at your workplace. Okay, so we're not going to go through an example on creating an API, but let me kind of just jump back into the software here real quick. And I'll just kind of show you what I mean by an API. So let me just open up PowerMill once again. And if you're not familiar with how to look at plugins in PowerMill, it's just a matter of going to your Backstage file. You're going to go into Options, and you're going to go into Manage Installed Plugins. So depending on what variant of PowerMill you have access to, you may or may not have what I have here because I've got Ultimate. I can't remember off the top of my head which ones come with what, but for instance, Robot 2020, it is enabled or turned on. We can see by the green dot. Same thing with the drilling automation and the Vericut interface. So if I want to utilize these plugins for my application at this point in time, I just simply can right-click in the viewing toolbar on the bottom right-hand corner, and I can either open it up in a vertical plugin or a horizontal. And actually, the robot plugin actually opens up both by default because simulation is in the horizontal. But you'll notice that all the plugins in here are on the right-hand side in this window. And it's undockable, so if I want to take it off and put it into another window or another monitor, I can do that. I can redock it. So a plugin allows me to create my own type of interface using the same type of language that the developer will use. So that's an example of a plugin. Then we also have an example of a plugin like the Vice Import macro, which we consider it a macro, but technically it's more like a hybrid macro and a plugin. So if you haven't seen the Vice add-in, I'm just going to go open up my echo commands here real quick. And let me just open up the folder here where I've got all my stuff stored. If I go into the Import Vice folder and I open up this document, there we go. Let me just drag this down here. So what we're going to do is just take this command. So it's this OLE file action command. So this is a PowerMill command that will fire up this executable file. So Control C. And we're going to jump back into PowerMill here. I'm going to paste it in the echo command like so. And that's going to raise our own little interface here that we can interact with. So we've got all of our default vices in here. You'll notice that I probably have a few added custom vices, like this 5th axis vice, different methods on how the part can be held, offsets, positions of the jaw against the stock or the model. And then depending on the type of device that we're using, we could have parallel support. In this case, there are no parallel supports. I'm not going to run through the add-in. If you're interested, reach out. I'll give you a hand. I'll send you the files. I'll send you the document. Okay, so what we're going to do is just kind of continue on with where we left off on Monday with the setup macro that we wrote. So let me just minimize PowerMill and let me bring in that file that we're working with. It's the camera. Drag and drop this in. And let me just turn on my shading. Okay. So the setup macro that we wrote on Monday is stored up in my custom tab. And if I click on this button, it's going to execute the macro. And if the macro pause is waiting for me to establish where my pickup or my reference point is. So I'm going to use the reference to a point on the block. We're going to resume the macro. And it's going to carry on. I'm going to set up my rapid plane height, which will be 1 inch from the top of my highest point on my block. And then we can kind of continue on with programming. And we also created the macro that will import my tools. So what if we wanted to interact a little bit more with this macro? Chances are we're not going to be working with stock material that is shrink fit to the size of my part. We're probably going to start with a larger piece of material. So let's interact with this macro just a little bit more to place these values in. So I'm just going to minimize PowerMill real quick, and we're going to jump back into my pmuser2 folder where I stored the setup macro. And I'm just going to double click it to open it. Okay, let me just close this. Installing, okay. So the first thing we're going to do is just set up a few variables, just like we did here with the safe area. And again, the variables can be whatever we want to call them. I just get in the habit of using the VAR, just so I know if I'm skipping through this, that I know that I've established a user variable. So maybe at the very beginning here, we're just going to establish a real value. Remember the difference between real and integers, and there's a few other ones that we can use as well. Like a string could be anything, could be a word. Okay, there's a better breakdown of what each one of these represents in the macro programming guide. So again, go up to the help menu, inside references or resources, sorry, there's an option there for the macro programming guide. It'll give you a breakdown of which each one of these represents. So real, it could be a number from 0.00001 all the way up to, I think it's 16 digits if I remember correctly. So you can put any value in there, where an int, which is an integer, it has to be a full value, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So that's why I'm using real. And then I'm going to establish the variable, which I'm going to use VAR for variable, so I know exactly what this is. And I'm just going to put variable X and maybe just len for length. And then I'm going to raise this little pop-up by inputting what the value actually is. So what is the length of the material? And I'll just put in parentheses X so I know exactly what I'm asking for. And I'm going to copy this. I'm going to paste it 2 times. And I'm going to put a Y length and a Z length. And I got a little spelling mistake here. That's okay. Maybe here I put what is the width of the part, of the material. And maybe this is going to refer to my Y. And then I'll do the same thing for the Z. Okay, so once we grab these variables, what do we do with them? So we didn't really grab any of the parameters, the PowerMill parameters, the first time around. So just so I can grab them, just so I know exactly what they are, I'm just going to open up PowerMill once again. I'm going to go into the block form, and I'm just going to simply type in some values here. 3.2, it really doesn't matter, but the overall length is what I'm looking for here. The only reason why I'm putting these lengths in now is that when I open up my echo commands, I can grab the parameters. So the edit, remember, I don't need the hard brackets, just the actual parameter, and the backslash and the R is just a character term, which is not required. So it just depends on where I want to place it in here. So I'm going to drop it in right after I establish the coordinate system, because I'm going to lock the coordinate system to the global transform. And at this point in time, I'm going to put this value in, and the length is going to be our variable. So block length is going to be this. It might even be a good idea to copy and paste this so there are no spelling mistakes, like so. And then we'll do the same thing for the Y. Actually, I deleted something I shouldn't have. I should have block XL, X length in there. Otherwise, that is not going to work. So XEL, LEN. There we go. So let me copy that. Control C, Control V. And this is going to be Y. And we're looking for the Y length, like so. Now for the Z, we're going to do something a little bit different, because if I change the Z length, it's going to lengthen it both in the positive and negative direction. So what I might want to do is just go back into the block form and just capture me locking out the Z. So it's going to be edit block Z min lock. I know I grabbed more than I should have, but I'll just remove that stuff. And then after I lock it is where I'm going to put the Z length, the Z length. Control C and Control V. And again, we don't want the actual value, we want the variable that we're calling. Like so. So let's go ahead and save that. And let's go ahead and give that a whirl. Let's see if this does exactly what we're looking for. So I'm going to close that block. And normally if I'm testing macros, I'm starting with like a sample file like we do here. And I'm going to close it. I'm going to go to options. I'm going to reset my forms. Very important that we do that, because it's going to change anything that we might have typed in manually or any of the forms that we might have modified back to the default. Okay, so let's import that file back in. There we go. Drag and drop that in. And I'm going to turn on the transform. The block, the reset forms doesn't turn the transform back on. So I'll do it manually. And let's run that macro again. So technically, we can just go back up here and run the part setup macro. And it's going to ask me for the length of the material, which is going to be 6.1. The width of the material is going to be 4.1. And the height of the material, let's go 2.5 inches. Okay, so you can see that it created the block, but maybe I reordered these in the wrong spot. So let's close out of this. Let's look at the macro once again. Okay, so we've got this model all select all up here. Okay, and we've got this form block. So let's just flash that out, because I don't really want to select the model in this case. I just want to create the block. Actually, no, I think we do want that. let's leave that block coordinate world. That's correct. Oh, we're missing one command here. Okay. Okay, so we're actually just going to put in this command, edit block reset. Basically what that's going to do is capture the block to the minimum size. So let's try that once again. Let's save this. And I'm going to close this down once again. And reset the forms. Let's import that file back in. It's there, camera. Let's drag this in. And let's just make sure I save this. And let's run the part setup once again. 6.1, 4.1, 2.5. And I must be missing something in this macro because it keeps resizing it back to the original size. Let me just take a look here. Let's transform, locking that out. Let me do something real quick. Select all, form block, coordinate world, block reset. Locking that. So I just had this reordered wrong. That's exactly what the problem is right there, that edit block reset. It's just resetting the block back to the shrink fit sizes. So I didn't see that. I could have just moved it up where I typed it manually before. So let's just save that. Let's do this one last time. So this is the fun part about troubleshooting your macros. Let's close this like so. Reset the forms. Drag this back in and run the part setup macro 6.1, 4.1, and let's go 2.5. There we go. So we can see the stock is exactly the sizes that we inputted in. And then we'll just carry on with adding the work plane, position on block, or whatever method you prefer. We're going to resume it. The rapid height is going to be 1 inch. And we turn off the transform. So at this point in time, we can start programming. Now on Monday, we also created that simple little macro to import my tools. So we could incorporate this into this macro as well. Maybe we want to ask the user if we want to import the tools at that point in time, or if we don't. So let's go ahead back into this macro here. And maybe what we'll do, let's back that up. Actually at the end here, right before we undraw the transform. Remember, these forward slashes are just comments. So at this point in time, I might ask imports the tools. And what we're going to do is we're going to raise a really simple way that we can kind of interact with the user as well. So it's a string, which again, it's just going to pop up a little window. And let's just go VAR tool for variable of tool. And then we're going to go input, import the tool template with a question mark. And then we're going to go 1 equals yes, or 2 equals no, like so. So we're just going to raise this question. And if the user puts in 1 or 2, 1 being yes, 2 being no, then we want to execute one of the 2 commands. So at this point in time, what we're doing is kind of breaking the macro into sections. We're giving it a choice. So we're going to put if the VAR, so the variable tool, equals, and we actually have to put 2 equals. This is basically I think it's Visual Basic or Visual Studio language for equals. So if this equals, and we're going to put this curly bracket in, think we have to put a space. And if, oh, sorry, I forgot to put a 1 in here. So if it equals 1, which is yes, then I want you to execute the following commands. So there's different ways, a couple different ways we can deal with this. We could physically put in the same command that we use to run the macro. So I can copy and paste what's in the macro, or I can actually run the macro within a macro. So that's a nice thing about writing these macros, that I could have 3 or 4 macros and I could just call on the macros when I choose to. So let's do it this way. I'm going to run the macro, and we're going to put quotations, and this is where we're going to store the path of where that macro is. So let's just minimize this real quick. I'm going to go into the folder here, and this is the macro. Actually, it's in my tools folder. This is the macro that I want to run. So let's go here. And actually, that's not what we want. Actually, let's click on this, Control C. Let's paste that portion of it in. And then let's put another /, and the macro is called import tools.max. Let me just copy and paste that just in case I make a spelling mistake. And close the quotation. So now, after it turns on the rapid plane, it's going to ask me if I want to run this macro or not. We're not finished yet, so I basically have to close out this portion of the macro. So I'm closing the curly bracket, and then I need to put the second choice in here, which will be if, let me copy and paste this, Control C, Control V, equals 2, then I want you to perform the second operation, or the other choice, which in this case, we don't have another choice. So I'm just simply going to close the curly bracket. Sometimes I might just put in here like a rotational move in here, maybe like a visual rotation move, but I'm just going to leave it empty. And if we were to choose to here, it would just run through this and continue on running the macro. Either one's going to continue running the macro. So let's go ahead and save that, and let's test this once again. Okay, so again, reset forms. Let's turn on our transform. Let's import that file back in. And let's go run the macro. So keeping with the theme of 6.1 by 4.1, we have 50 thou per side, maybe an extra 1/4 inch or so on the top. And I'm just going to snap it to the block this time instead of using the other option. The rapid height's going to be 1.5 inches from the top of my block. And it's now asking me, do I want to import the tool template or my tool? So I'm going to hit 1 in here for yes. And we should see the tools pop up, which we do, and the transform turns off. Okay, so this little bit of automation here just gets me ready to start programming quicker. So one click of a button just did a bunch of different operations for me. Okay, so that's a really easy way of you recording and editing a macro. As I mentioned in the description of this webinar, what I thought I would do as well is just record another easy to do macro, which would be to basically create a stock model at this point in time, and we'll run those roughing strategies we saved on Monday. So these are the roughing strategies we stored up in our strategy selector, right? So we've got our 3/4, a 1/2 inch, and our 1/4 inch roughing toolpaths. So at this point in time, again, we can record a macro just to kind of get us starting off, or if we're comfortable enough, I'm going to jump back into my folder, and I'm going to go into the PMill 2 folder, and let's go ahead and create a new text document. I'm going to rename this one roughing, and I'm going to change the extension to .mac for macro. And it gives me this warning. I'm just going to accept it. Let's open up this macro. and we're left with a clean palette here, if you will. So let's go ahead and I'm going to open up PowerMill. What I'm going to do is just kind of split the screen like so. Just drag it to the top of my window. Oops. I got two monitors here, so let's just snap that here. There we go. Okay, just so we can kind of see a split screen here. There we go. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, just like we did in the block definition, is let's just establish a couple variables. Because when we create a stock model, if I were to create a stock model, there's some items in here that we can possibly change, like the tolerance, the step over, the rest thickness. So let's go ahead and just establish those macros or those variables. So establish variables for stock model values. And maybe the first one, again, we're going to use a real because we can put, decimal places in. And this one's going to be VAR, and then I might put TOL for tolerance, and then input stock model tolerance. Question. And then let's do this again, real VAR. Let's go STP for step over. Okay. Just noticed I spelled that wrong. And let's do this once again. And maybe I want to do rest thickness. So let's go VAR, and then I'm going to go RST for rest. Input rest thickness. And close those out. So we're going to establish those first three variables. And then the very first thing we're going to do is we're going to create the stock model. So I can close this out. Actually, I'm going to leave it open for now. Let me just open up the echo commands because we already created the stock model, which is this command. So I'm going to copy and paste that in like so. So we're basically going to create the stock model. And then let's go ahead and rename the stock model. Let's just call it stock. Let's copy that. So if you remember from Monday, no, I encourage you to remove these ones because for whatever reason, if I were to leave that stock model as number one and then run this maybe again, it already thinks that there's a stock model already created called number one. So I'm just going to change this with the pound sign, which that indicates to PowerMill to rename the very last stock model as stock. Okay, and then we're just going to change these values a little bit just to extract the commands, like so. So let's copy this command, Control C. Like so, and let's do the rest thickness here as well. And obviously we don't want the actual values here, we want the variables. So tolerance, we're going to replace that with our variable name. Control C, the step over, we're going to replace that as well. And same thing with our rest variable, like so. Okay, so once we establish those variables, what we want to do is just hit accept. And really, we don't really need that portion, but let's just grab it anyway. I'd rather have too much than something that's going to cause the macro to break. So after we establish just the settings of the stock model, what we need to do is apply a block. So let's just right click, apply block, Control C. Actually, I need that semicolon as well, like so. And then let's actually calculate that block. And notice that the value or the command places a 0 at the end. So the index state, or the state of the stock model at this point in time is 0, which is just the block, the highest level. Okay, so let's go ahead and let's delete this stock model. And let's go see if this macro works. Let's save it. And I'm going to open up our folder. There's our roughing. And I'm just going to drag and drop it into the PowerMill window. And it's going to ask me for the stock model tolerance. Maybe it's going to be 3 thousandths. The step over will be 40 thousandths. The rest thickness will be 30 thousandths. Because if we're roughing, maybe I want to keep everything, within a certain value, like for visual purposes. But just remember, this can be changed. The other two parameters cannot be changed once we establish the stock model. Okay, so that portion of the stock model works. So let's go ahead and take this a little bit further and let's start programming some toolpaths. So maybe I have a process at my shop where I use the same 3 or 4 tools every time I rough a block out. And I incorporate some rest machining. So maybe the very first toolpath that we run after this would be the toolpath that we saved on Monday. So I'm going to expand my strategy selector. So there are some things that you do not need to place. Okay, there we go. There's some things that we don't need to place in the actual macro itself, like forms. Okay, the Explorer selection stuff. We don't really require those. That's just going to pop up unnecessary boxes maybe in my macro. So it's really stuff like editing or par values that we want to capture in. So let's just open up the strategy selector, which I don't need that command. In the roughing strategy, I don't need that selector. I'm going to select the template that we saved, and I'm going to hit OK. So really all I need out of all of those mouse button clicks is the import function, which is this import template up to that point. So Control C and Control V. And just before I get too far here, I'm just going to put some comments in here so I know exactly what's happening. So the comments here are going to be runs the first toolpath on my model. Okay, so a couple things we might want to change in here. One is going to be, let's rename this. So let's rename this 3/4 inch roughing. Enter. Oops. Yeah, so that's where we're going to get our error there because there's already a toolpath named number 1. So let's just Control C, Control V, and let's take that number 1 out and follow that with the colon here. So we talked about what this one does. What this one does is it renames the active, whatever the active toolpath is, to the name that we have in the print or the quotations here. Okay, so then let's go ahead and hit calculate. Because we don't really need this stock model at this point in time because the block and the stock model are actually the same size. So we don't have to incorporate any rest machining yet. All right, see if we can copy that command here while we're waiting for that to calculate. Control C, Control V. Nope. Is there something open here? Give me 1 second. Drag that away. Seems to be kind of hung up here. All right, let's take a look. I don't know why that's not calculating, but let's close that. Let's try this method. Maybe it was hung up on that error that I had earlier. Okay, so let's try expanding this folder, and let's rename this 3/4 inch roughing. Okay, so that's that ugly warning that we're getting. Let's yeah, that's something is kind of broken here. Delete. Let's do this once again. So let's import. Let's leave the rename function for a little bit here. Okay, so let's leave that as number 1, and we're just going to hit OK. And so let's rename it here. Okay, there's something. Okay, let's. I think PowerMill's kind of hung up on something here. Let's quit that. Okay, yeah, I think it was just kind of hung up on 1/4 inch roughing. Interesting. Okay, let's rename it to something else. Let's just call it rougher. I'm not sure why it's not letting me rename it that, but let's copy this command and let's replace it with this one. And remember that we don't want the actual name here. We want whatever the active entity is, which will be the semicolon. One thing also that we might want to incorporate here is we just want the command to close out that window, because this will actually open up this Toolpath form. So when I hit OK, I just want this form accept. I want that button, or I want that command to close it down. And I do not need the hard bracket. Okay, so at this point in time, we've created the stock model. We're going to import one of our templates. We're going to basically close it and rename it. Okay, and then we can actually calculate it by going into Toolpath, calculate. That'll calculate the active toolpath. And you'll notice that it actually puts that semicolon in there because that's telling PowerMill to calculate the active toolpath, which in this case is rougher. Seems to be hanging here on me. Not quite sure why. Okay, so since PowerMill's not behaving with what I'm trying to do here, let me just let me close this and let's reopen up PowerMill.
Yeah, I was just going to suggest that, Chris, maybe just to do a quick
Yeah,
reboot of that.
I think maybe something in that macro that I was trying to run before might have triggered something internally. So let's just fire it back up. Okay, let's do this once again. So that the good thing is we have this nice little macro. We can just get back to where we were. Okay, so there's our block. Let's run through our macro. Like so, resume. Let's go 1 inch. And yes, we want to import the tools in. Okay, so let's try this again. We're going to do this a little bit more on the manual side. So let's just go up to my objects here, or my strategy selector. Let's open this. And let's just verify that it will calculate, because I'm not sure why it's not calculating. Okay, so I'm going to leave everything the same, calculate. Okay. I wonder if it's just, maybe it's just my impatience and this GoToWebinar is causing a little slug here. So, because I know this should calculate, let me just cancel this once again. My apologies. Let's just make this, let's just get out of Vortex. I'm just going to go into a standard roughing strategy. Step over of, let's go 0.3, step down of, let's just go 1/4 inch. Let's calculate that guy. Okay, so I think it's just something to do with the strategy itself. So it's probably just Vortex and then plus GoToMeetings kind of making everything a little bit sluggish. So let's recycle that. Calculate. Oops, set wrong command. Let's shut this off. Plunge moves. Okay, so we know how to handle plunge moves. That's just a ramp. It's just a little PowerMill query that we need to add a ramp move. So let's just add that in real quick. Feed in. Let's add a ramp. Let's go 2 degrees. Calculate. There we go. So the nice thing is that at this point, I'm not too concerned with the efficiency of the toolpath. Let's just go ahead and resave this back to my templates. So let's save the strategy as, and I'm going to overwrite this 3/4, which is taking some time to overwrite. Okay, so now if we were to delete this toolpath and carry on with that macro, I think we're going to have more success this way. Okay, so let's carry on with this macro. So when I import that object or that template, we're going to rename it rougher. And I'm just going to type in the command edit. Actually, let's just extract it because I know what the command is. So the command should be up here to edit toolpath calculate. That's the command that will actually calculate that toolpath for us, like so. but we don't want number 1. And what we're going to do is run this macro at this point in time. Let's just make sure that this macro is working for us with the stock model and everything. So save that. And try to get in a habit of making sure you only have one of these open at a time, because I get in a habit of maybe opening up 2 and then I'm editing one. It's not the current version. So let's go PMill 2, roughing, stock model tolerance. Let's go 4 thousandths. Step over 60, 50 for rest thickness. And it should import that strategy for us and calculate it, which it did. Okay, so I think we can start carrying on with the rest of this macro. So when we calculate a toolpath, especially the first rougher, what we need to do now is add this to the stock model, because right now the history in the stock model is just showing where the block is. So let's go ahead and add this to the stock model. And the command is to add this to the last point of time on the tree. Let's add this in here. And then we need the command to actually calculate the new state of the stock model, which will be now 1. So if you look, the block would be 0. It's now showing me the history of which is state number 1 with the newest toolpath that we just calculated. Okay, so let's go ahead and carry on with this. Let's runs the second toolpath on my stock model. Okay, so really nothing's changed here with the order of operations. The very first thing is going to be this import method. So let's go back up to the strategy selector. The next one's going to be my 1/2 inch. So we want the import line here. Control C, let's paste that in. And we don't need this stuff on the back. And we're going to keep the same type of, actually before we close out of this form, what we want to do is, you notice that the little checkbox for rest machining has been turned on because it's stored with the strategy. What we want to do is go up into the rest page, and I'm just going to hard code to make sure that it's using the stock model method, just in case. So let's copy this command, Control C, Control V, and I'm going to use my stock. And I'm just going to make sure I hard code that we're using the rougher. So I'm actually going to just select it, but it's not actually going to put the name in there. It's actually referring back to the state, which is going to be state number 1, like so. Okay, and then I can actually close the form. I can actually just copy and paste this form and close it, like so. And then I'm going to rename the toolpath. And maybe instead of rougher, maybe I call it rest 1. And then we're going to calculate the toolpath. So I can actually copy that as well. Okay, and then I can actually copy both of these lines as well. So it's going to save me a little bit of time of just extracting the commands out of PowerMill. So what I'm going to do, instead of using the rougher, let's go rest 1 in here. So I'm going to put rest 1 as the last point on my stock model. And then I wanted to calculate it and make sure that it's showing me the state of state number 2. Okay, and let's just carry on with this. So we're going to run the third toolpath. So runs the third toolpath on my stock model, like so. And I'm actually going to copy and paste all of this stuff, Control C, Control V, and we're going to actually import that file in from PowerMill, which is going to be a 1/4 inch. The only reason why I'm importing this in is I just want this line. Okay, so if we kind of read through this, so I'm just hard coding that we're using a stock model instead of a toolpath. I'm using the same stock model. Now, instead of referring to the first state or the 3/4 inch end mill toolpath, I want to refer to the second state, right? This toolpath. And we're going to accept the form. We're going to rename this one to Rest 2. I'm going to calculate it. And then Rest 2, I'm going to place that at the very end of my stock model. And then this is going to be the third state, like so. So once you get into this routine, it's just more or less copy and pasting the commands that already exist in the macro and just kind of renaming some of the functions. So let's go ahead and save that stock model, that macro, and let's see if this works. So let's delete all the toolpaths first, since they're locked to the stock model, and then let's delete the stock model. Okay, so there's my roughing macro. Let's go ahead and import that in. Stock model tolerance is going to be 4 thousandths. Step over, let's go 50 thousandths. Rest thickness of 50. And hopefully the other two toolpaths don't hang on me, but it should be much quicker. Okay, so we've got all 3 toolpaths calculate off the stock model. It's showing us where we're at in time according to the stock model. And if we look at our macro, it's not too difficult once we get past, the first one. We can start copying and pasting some of the commands, and makes things a little bit easier to manage. Okay, so maybe one last thing what we're going to do is just put in some collision checking in here. So I'm just going to put in a little bit of logic in here, and I'll kind of explain to you what we're doing. So for each is a parameter that we're going to use. That what we're going to do is just go for each TP. This is a PowerMill macro TP. Okay, so that's not something I'm going to establish in folder. So that's just kind of retracting back to this. This is basically a PowerMill variable. It's that's kind of why I always put this VAR in front, because if I'm not careful, I can call out a PowerMill variable. So this one's already an established variable that PowerMill uses. So, sticking this VAR is going to eliminate maybe any potential issues. Okay, so for each toolpath in folder, and I'm going to put parentheses in here and toolpath. Then I'm going to put that squiggly bracket. So there's a little bit more information on the macro programming guide about this. And in here, I'm going to put in the command activate toolpath. And this is a command that you can just copy and then replace the actual name with another PowerMill variable, which is tp.name. And then for each toolpath in that folder, I want to edit, collision, and apply. So what we're going to do is that every single toolpath that's in that folder, I'm going to collision check it with just the default variables that are in there. So let's save this once again. And I'm going to go ahead and delete all these toolpaths and delete the stock model. Let's rerun that roughing macro. Okay, so we're going to rough out the first toolpath, then the second toolpath. And then once the third toolpath has been calculated, it will go ahead and collision check every toolpath. That's in the toolpaths folder. Oh, I must type something out wrong here. In folder, DP. Okay, well, I'll go ahead and fix this. It's probably some small little typo. And if you want, I'll go ahead and I'll send it to you when we reach back out on this after this webinar. I'll go ahead and send you this macro as well as the other ones. So let's just exit out of that real quick. One last thing I kind of want to just show you guys when it comes to the automation in PowerMill, some things that we can do. You know, we can modify the ribbon interface by creating our own custom tabs, right? We can modify the quick access toolbar by just right clicking and customizing, which we did a little bit on Monday. But also what we could do is open up or create our own user menu. So by default, when you right click in the Explorer, you should see no menu pop up. But you can see in mine, I've got this little menu that pops up and I've got one command, which is unlock project. So where is this coming from? Well, on Monday, when we talked about sorting our paths in here and we went into our macro paths, I've established this folder, which is the folder that's on my desktop in this this folder here. And in this folder, in my pmuser folder, I've got this user menu. And there's two different methods we could use to establish a user menu. There's an XML style and then there's an HTML style. So it depends on which you're comfortable with. I've been using this quite a long time, so I like using the XML method better because, sorry, it's just a text document, just because I just find it a little bit more easier to use. But all the little hashtags here, we'll just skip over these lines, almost like line comments in our macro. The T is the actual menu name. The I is the name of the execution we're going to place in. The one here, and then the quotation is the actual PowerMill parameter. Same parameters that we grabbed from the command window down the bottom. Okay, we can also run macros through here as well. So just a quick example, if I wanted to add another command in here, if I put in an I and then just put a name, it could be rainbow shade. And then I'm just going to tab it over, tab it over, and you don't really need to tab it. I just try to keep things clean. And now I just need to execute what the command is for turning on my rainbow shade, which is view model rainbow shade. So let's copy and paste that command. Like so. I'm going to go ahead and save this. And the nice thing is next time I go ahead and use the user menu, I'll change this back to plain shade real quick, is that command already exists. And if I click it, it's going to execute that command. So it's a nice way of keeping things nice and neat and tidy in this little menu that pops up. You can also put menus. So back here, if I put S, that's a space. If I put M, that's a menu. So the menu could be drawing options. And then you would just follow the same suit. Control V. Let's copy that again. Control V. And let's put a Z. Oops. So a Z at the end basically closes the menu out, and then S for space. So really, there's only a few letters you need to remember, but I'm just going to leave the same commands in there, just so you get an idea of what it does, just because we're nearing the end of this webinar. But there's our menu, and then again, each one I select would run the same command. So we're running out of time here. I was hoping to showcase a few other items, but hopefully you guys gained some knowledge here, especially when it comes to writing and recording macros. I just want to thank everybody again for staying with me for the last couple hours. Hopefully it's been informative again. I don't know if Rob has any questions that arise during this webinar that he wants me to go over.
I'm looking. There's no questions from anybody out there, but I have one question. If someone was to want to find out where they can find the API callouts, all the items that you listed, some of the things that you came up with that PowerMill will do, where can you find that information?
So again, some of the things are just things that you pick up over time. The forum is by far the best place to go. So let me just pop this open real quick. And let me just open this up. The best place to go in my mind is the PowerMill forum. So when you go to the PowerMill forum, a lot of it is just macro commands. You know, if there's something you want to learn in here, ask a question. Most likely someone's going to answer that question for you. Okay. So the PowerMill forum is by far the first spot I would go after you kind of start out with writing these. The other place is if you want to get into writing APIs, there's actually a separate PowerShape and PowerMill API forum. And this is digging into more or less like the Vice macro. And again, a lot of good people in here that will share their knowledge. Okay. But I suggest kind of starting out slow, start out with the macro stuff. And then once you kind of grasp onto that, dive into the API if it's going to help you out. Third, directly in PowerMill, documentation, macro programming guide. Excuse me. So that's something that I print out. I've got it in a nice little binder, and you know it's a nice 150 sheet documentation based on how the PowerMill macros and the language works. It goes from 0 to 100 pretty quick, but if you're looking for certain information, like you know how to run string commands or even variables, this is where you should kind of start. Okay.
Looks like some light reading.
Yeah, the best thing exactly. The best thing what I like when I was starting out was I would go to the forum, and if I saw a really cool macro, even though I might not necessarily know what it's doing, I would copy that macro and place it into a folder where I've got all kinds of just default macros that you know I can refer to. Because for me, even like I don't consider myself to be an advanced macro writer, but if I'm writing something, I need to refer myself to something. I can't just write these commands out from the top of my head. Some of them I can, but for the most part, I need to refer to a macro that already works, and I kind of pluck and paste it into my macro. So
I'd say that's a pretty common practice out there. We've all done that in the past.
Yeah, I'm not a developer, so I can't think that quick.
Awesome. Well, we have
Anything
no
else,
other
Rob?
questions, so
Nothing else?
Nope.
All right, so what I'll do though, for everybody that was involved in this webinar, is I will give you guys these macros just as a starting point if you're interested. So anything that we did over the last 2 hours, like Monday and Friday, I'll copy those up, I'll zip them up in a folder and I'll send them over to you. Okay. So again, thanks everyone for showing up. Enjoy the nice weekend. If you're in Canada, enjoy the long weekend. Yeah, we'll look forward to seeing you guys again in future webinars.
Thank you all.
Thank you.